Hey friends, tonight we're trading in whatever climate-controlled bedroom you're currently melting into for something a little harsher, a little quieter, and a lot more honest about what winter actually used to mean. Tonight, we're heading north, past the last motorway, past the last street lamp, into the deep folded valleys of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, where the sun sometimes forgets to show up at all, and a wooden cabin standing alone in the snow was the only thing between a family and a cold that could genuinely kill you. This is Bedtime Survivalist, and before we get into it, a warm thank you to the viewer who requested this one in the comments. You have no idea how much these requests shape what we build here, and I mean that sincerely. If you enjoy where we're headed tonight, a like or a subscribe helps more than you'd think, though only if it feels right to you, never because you feel like you owe us one. And if you'd rather just close your eyes and let the words carry you, the whole back catalogue is on Spotify now too, links in the description, along with the long-form, ad-free 8-hour versions for the nights you really don't want to surface again until morning. Now get comfortable, pull the blanket up, maybe crack a window if you like, your air the way we're about to discover an entire civilization insisted on it. And let's ask a few questions before we go anywhere. Have you ever been cold enough that the cold stopped being a sensation and became a kind of company, something that sat in the room with you? Have you ever watched your own breath hang in the air above your face and thought, quietly, that maybe this is just what the night is now? Have you ever built a small, warm world out of nothing but wool and fire and the people nearest to you, because outside that world there was simply nothing but dark and snow for 100 miles in every direction? Now imagine that isn't a single unlucky night. Imagine that's October through April. Imagine that's every year, for centuries, for families who never once considered it a hardship worth complaining about because it was simply Tuesday and Wednesday and every day until spring finally remembered they existed. Welcome to a Scandinavian winter, somewhere in the 1800s, in a cabin with walls thick enough to argue with a blizzard and win. You open your eyes if there was ever really a moment of closing them. Because sleep up here follows its own strange arithmetic in a season with almost no daylight to mark the hours. The room is dim, lit only by the low orange breathing of a stove in the corner. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, wind is worrying at the eaves the way it has all night, the way it will again tomorrow. And the first thing you notice, the thing that will define everything else you learn tonight, is how deliberately, how carefully this entire life was built around the simple, unglamorous problem of not dying of cold. Let's start where any sensible survival story has to start, the land itself. Picture Scandinavia stripped of its modern conveniences and laid bare as what it actually is geographically, which is a genuinely brutal place to try to live through winter. We're talking about a region stretching from the gentler farmland of southern Sweden up through the long spine of Norway, and into the Arctic reaches of Finnish and Sami territory, where, for parts of the year, the sun simply does not rise above the horizon at all. Polar night, they call it up there, and it is exactly as ominous as it sounds. Even in the more populated south, daylight in December might amount to 5 or 6 thin hours, a pale smear of grey between one long darkness and the next. Cold in this climate isn't a single temperature you brace for once and adjust to. It's a moving target that can plunge without warning, made worse by wind funneling down fjords and across open, treeless plateaus, made worse again by damp coastal air that cuts through wool in a way dry inland, cold somehow doesn't. Snow isn't an occasional inconvenience, it's the baseline condition of existence for roughly half the year, sometimes piling deep enough to bury a ground floor window, sometimes arriving in blizzards that could erase a familiar path between house and barn in under an hour. And here is the detail that should reframe everything else in this story before we've even gotten to the cabin door. These families were often profoundly isolated. Not isolated the way we mean it now, an inconvenient drive to the nearest shop. Isolated as in the nearest neighbouring farm might be a genuine trek through drifted snow, the nearest village further still, and once a serious storm settled in, a household might be entirely cut off, entirely on its own, for days or even weeks at a stretch. There was no calling for help. There was no help coming even if you could call. Whatever you needed to survive the winter, you had already needed to have gathered, built, salted, dried, chopped, and stored months before the first real snowfall arrived. This is the frame you have to hold on to for everything that follows tonight. Every choice we're about to walk through, the shape of the walls, the size of the windows, the placement of the stove, the timing of the evening meal, wasn't decoration or tradition for tradition's sake. It was engineering, quiet, patient, generations deep engineering against a landscape that offered no forgiveness for getting it wrong. And the remarkable thing, the thing that makes this such a soothing story rather than a grim one, is how well they actually solved it. Long before insulated jackets and double-glazed windows, these families built themselves warm, dry, surprisingly comfortable little worlds inside some of the harshest winters on the planet, not through anything exotic, through wood, wool, fire, and an almost meditative attentiveness to the rhythm of a single evening, repeated with only small variations, night after night, for months on end. Because that rhythm is really what tonight is about. Not one dramatic night of survival against the odds, but the quiet, practiced choreography of an ordinary evening, done so many times it had worn itself smooth, the way a path through snow becomes packed and easy underfoot after enough people have walked it, coming in from the cold, tending the fire, cooking the simple meal, settling the children, layering the wool, letting the stove's heat carry the whole household through to morning. Simple steps, done with total competence by people who had no other option but to get very, very good at being warm in the dark. So let's step properly into that cabin now, because before we can understand how a family slept warm inside one, we need to understand how on earth these buildings were built to make that possible at all, out in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but an axe, a forest, and several thousand years of accumulated know-how about exactly how wood behaves when the temperature drops low enough to crack stone. The cabins themselves, the kind we're talking about tonight, weren't thrown together. They were the product of an old and remarkably sophisticated timber-building tradition that Scandinavians had been refining for centuries, a method sometimes called laft in Norway, nuttimring in Sweden, essentially horizontal log construction where whole trunks, carefully selected, seasoned, and shaped, were stacked one atop another and locked together at the corners with interlocking notches cut with startling precision. This mattered enormously because the entire logic of a log cabin's warmth comes down to mass and airtightness working together. A thick, solid log wall behaves completely differently from a thin, framed wall with empty space inside it. Wood is naturally a decent insulator on its own, but a log wall a foot thick, built from dense, slow-grown northern pine or spruce that had spent a century fighting for every inch of height in a harsh climate, had enormous thermal mass. It absorbed heat slowly during the day, released it slowly through the night, and resisted the outside cold with sheer, stubborn physical bulk in a way a modern thin wall never could without help. But mass alone wasn't enough, because logs, however thick, still have gaps between them, tiny irregularities where one round trunk sits against another. And this is where the real cleverness comes in. Builders pack these gaps with moss, a material harvested specifically for the purpose, sometimes mixed with clay, tar, or animal hair, pressed firmly into every seam between the logs. Moss turned out to be an extraordinary insulator in its own right, and critically, it moved slightly as the logs expanded and contracted with temperature and humidity, so the seal held even as the building itself flexed through the seasons, rather than cracking open the way a rigid mortar joint eventually would. The roof told the same story of patient, layered defense against the cold. Many older cabins used turf roofing, actual soil and living grass laid over birch bark on a timber frame, an approach that sounds almost absurdly rustic until you understand what it accomplished. That layer of earth and root systems provided remarkable insulation, kept the structure below dry by shedding water through the bark layer beneath it, and in deep winter, a snow-covered turf roof effectively became its own extra blanket, trapping air and reflecting cold rather than conducting it straight through into the rafters. And then there were the windows, or rather, the deliberate lack of them. Anyone looking at an old Scandinavian farmhouse today notices it immediately. The windows are small, sometimes strikingly small, set deep into thick walls, occasionally no larger than a modest square of glass, or, in the oldest examples, a stretched, translucent animal membrane before glass became widely affordable. This wasn't a failure of ambition, it was restraint, chosen deliberately, because every square inch of window is a square inch where the wall's careful thermal defences simply stop working, where warm air inside meets cold glass and loses the argument every single time. Given how little daylight there was to let in during the winter months anyway, the trade-off made itself. Better to keep the walls doing their job of holding heat in and rely instead on firelight and the low, steady glow of the hearth to see by during the long evenings. It's a small decision, but it tells you almost everything about the mindset behind these homes. Comfort wasn't chased through openness or light, it was built deliberately, log by log, seam by seam, out of thickness, darkness, and an unshakable respect for exactly how the cold moved and where it would get in if you let it. Standing inside one of these cabins on a January evening then wasn't like standing inside a modern insulated house, quiet and neutral about the season outside. It was something closer to standing inside a very patient, very deliberate machine, one built entirely out of trees and moss and turf, whose sole and singular purpose was keeping a small pocket of livable warmth alive against an entire landscape that wanted, with total indifference, to take it away. And every evening, as the light failed outside those small, deep-set windows, that machine had to be actively, attentively run by the people living inside it, which is exactly where we're headed next, as the working day outside finally comes to its close, and the household turns its full attention toward getting safely, warmly through the night ahead. The working day in a Scandinavian winter didn't so much end as get interrupted by darkness, with daylight rationed down to a handful of grey hours, whatever needed doing outside, tending animals, hauling wood, checking on stored provisions, clearing a path through fresh drifts, had to be compressed into that narrow window before the light gave out entirely. And so, as afternoon slid toward what barely qualified as evening, you'd feel the whole rhythm of the farmstead shift, a kind of collective, unspoken agreement that it was time to come inside and not go back out again until morning. This mattered because coming inside wasn't simply a matter of walking through a door. It was itself a small ritual, practiced and precise. Because doing it badly meant dragging the cold in with you, undoing hours of careful heat management in the space of a careless minute. The entryway of a working farm cabin, often a small enclosed porch or vestibule rather than a door opening directly into the main room, existed specifically to manage this transition, a kind of airlock between the brutal outside and the carefully guarded warmth within. Here, the outer layers came off first. Heavy wool coats, often treated or felted to resist wet snow, hung on pegs to dry rather than being carried, damp and dripping, into the main living space where the moisture would only work against the fire's efforts. Boots, frequently lined with straw or dried grass for insulation, a wonderfully clever bit of low-cost engineering that trapped warm air around the foot far more effectively than the boot leather alone ever could, came off and were set near enough to the stove to dry through the night without scorching. Mittens, often knitted in dense, tightly worked wool, sometimes doubled up in the harshest weather, were peeled off fingers gone stiff and pale from hours outside. And the animals came in too, in their own fashion. On many farms, the barn or byre stood directly attached to the main house, or close enough that a covered walkway connected the two. And this wasn't merely convenience. Livestock, cattle especially, generate a genuinely significant amount of body heat, and a shared or adjoining wall between animal shelter and human living space meant that heat wasn't simply wasted into the winter air. It bled gently through into the house, a kind of low ambient warming system running on nothing more than hay and metabolism. Bringing the animals in close for the night, checking they were fed, watered and settled, was as much a part of the family's own thermal comfort as it was basic animal husbandry, even if nobody framed it in quite those terms at the time. Once inside properly, the family gathered in what was usually the single main living space of the cabin, because heating multiple separate rooms through a Scandinavian winter was, for most households, simply an unaffordable luxury of both fuel and effort. This was often called the stew, a central room that functioned as kitchen, dining space, workroom, and in many cases sleeping quarters all at once, everyone and everything drawn naturally toward its centre point, which was, without exception, the stove. And it's here, in this gathering, in this deliberate contraction of the whole household into one warm, firelit room, while the enormous dark of a Nordic winter night pressed in against thick log walls outside, that the real evening properly begins. Because everything that follows tonight, The tending of the fire, the cooking of the meal, the mending and the storytelling, the slow layering on of wool as the hour grew late, all of it happened inside this same small circle of warmth and light, night after night, season after season, for as long as the winter chose to last. There was also a quieter, more human side to this transition indoors, one worth sitting with for a moment. After a day spent largely in silence and effort, hauling wood, breaking ice off the well, checking snares or feeding stock in bitter wind, coming inside carried a kind of psychological relief that went beyond simple physical warmth. The main room, with its low light and the small sounds of a fire settling, offered the first real chance all day to simply exist without fighting something. Shoulders dropped, voices softened. Children who had been bundled and stoic all day suddenly had permission to be children again, tumbling out of stiff outer layers and into whatever softer indoor clothes the household kept for evenings. There is something worth noticing here about pacing too, because it will come up again and again tonight. Nothing about this transition happened quickly. Clothes were hung, not dropped. Boots were set just so, not kicked off carelessly. Even the simple act of easing frozen fingers back to feeling held near, but never directly against the stove, was done slowly, almost ceremonially, because Scandinavian households understood something that's easy for us to forget in an age of instant central heating. Warming a cold body too fast, especially cold hands or feet, could be genuinely painful and occasionally damaging. Better to let warmth arrive gradually, the same unhurried way the whole evening would unfold from here. And so, by the time the last boot was drying and the last mitten hung to thaw, the household had, without anyone particularly narrating it as such, completed the first and arguably most important task of the entire evening. They had successfully sealed the cold outside and gathered the whole of their small world into one warm, close, fire-lit room. Everything that mattered for the next several hours, cooking, mending, talking, eventually sleeping, was going to happen inside this single space, orbiting the one object in the room that made any of it possible at all. Which brings us, at last, properly to the stove. If the log walls were the machine's armour, silently holding the cold at bay hour after hour, the stove was its engine, and it deserves every bit of the reverence it clearly held in these households. In the more established farmhouses of Sweden in particular, this often meant a kakelun, a tiled masonry stove, tall, often strikingly beautiful, with hand-painted ceramic tiles, and built on principles that were, frankly, ahead of their time. Unlike an open hearth, which sends most of its heat straight up the chimney along with the smoke, a masonry stove was designed with a long winding internal flue, forcing the hot combustion gases to travel a lengthy indirect path before finally escaping outside. Along that path, the enormous mass of brick, stone and tile absorbed heat steadily and then released it slowly for many hours afterward, long after the fire itself had burned down to embers. This meant a single, relatively modest fire, lit perhaps once or twice a day and fed for an hour or two, could keep a masonry stove radiating gentle, steady warmth for 12 hours or more. It's a beautifully efficient bit of thermal engineering, essentially a heat battery built from clay and stone, and it's the single biggest reason a family could go to sleep at night with the fire banked low and reasonably trust the room to still be tolerably warm by the time anyone woke. In older or more rural cabins without access to a proper masonry stove, the open hearth, sometimes called an aura, served a similar central role, though with rather more hands-on effort required to keep it useful through the night. And this is where the evening's most quietly important skill came into play. One passed down carefully from parent to child, precisely because getting it wrong meant either a frozen household by morning or, at the other extreme, a genuinely dangerous house fire. Tending a fire properly for the night wasn't as simple as piling on wood and walking away. It was a deliberate, practiced art called banking the coals, and it worked like this. As the evening's cooking and heating fire burned down toward its final active hour, rather than letting it die out completely or feeding it fresh, fast-burning kindling, the household would carefully rake the glowing coals into a compact pile, often toward the back or side of the hearth, then cover them, partially, with ash. That layer of ash acted as an insulating blanket over the embers themselves, slowing their burn dramatically, starving them of enough oxygen to flare up, but never quite enough to let them go fully cold. A well-banked fire, tended by an experienced hand, could hold a bed of living coals through 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours of quiet, low-intensity burn, ready to be uncovered, fed fresh wood, and coaxed back to a proper blaze within minutes come morning. This was not a skill anyone was born knowing. Children in these households learned the feel of it early, the exact way ash should be mounded, the particular hiss and smell that told you whether you'd banked it correctly or smothered it entirely, because an entire family's comfort through a January night depended on someone in that room genuinely understanding fire, not just fearing or enjoying it. There was real pride taken in doing this well. A fire that lasted the night without needing to be relit from scratch, without ever throwing a spark loose onto the floor, was a small daily act of quiet competence, the kind that probably went unremarked most nights precisely because it was done so consistently well. The wood itself mattered enormously too, and choosing it correctly was its own small science, learned through generations of trial and cold, unforgiving error. Birch was prized widely across the region for burning hot, clean, and relatively fast, excellent for the sharp burst of heat needed to cook a meal or take the initial chill off a room. Pine and spruce, more resinous, burned readily and were abundant, useful for kindling and for a fire that needed to be brought up to temperature quickly, though they left more soot and burned somewhat less steadily for the long overnight stretch. Denser hardwoods, where available alder, oak in the southern reaches, were often saved specifically for that final evening load. The wood chosen to burn slowest and longest, exactly the qualities needed to feed a fire meant to hold through darkness. All of this wood, of course, had to already be there, already split, seasoned and stacked, often under a covered lean-to right against the house itself, for easy access without a trek through deep snow at 10 at night. Woodcutting wasn't a winter task at all, really. It was a summer and autumn task, an entire season's labour invested months in advance, precisely so that every evening through the coldest months could unfold calmly, without anyone needing to face a snowstorm at dusk because the woodpile had run low. It's a lovely, patient bit of foresight. This idea that comfort in February was actually earned back in August, swinging an axe in warm daylight, so that a future, colder version of yourself would simply be able to reach out, take a log, and feed a fire that was already, reliably, doing its job. And there was, beyond the pure practicality of it, something genuinely emotional bound up in the stove's glow that's worth pausing on before we move to what that fire was actually cooking. Across Scandinavian folk tradition, the hearth carried a weight of meaning well beyond mere heat. Old beliefs held that a household spirit, sometimes called a tomt or nisse, depending on the region, watched over the farm and its buildings and keeping the hearth tended properly, keeping the home warm, orderly, and cared for, was itself thought to keep this quiet guardian content. Whether or not anyone in a given household truly believed a small bearded figure was watching from the shadows of the barn, the underlying sentiment rings true and clear across the centuries regardless. A well-tended fire meant a well-tended household in every sense that mattered, practical and otherwise, and the stove sat at the centre of that whole idea, the literal and symbolic heart of the home, glowing quietly through the long Nordic dark. With the fire properly settled and doing its patient work for the evening, the household's attention would naturally turn next to the meal, because a day spent in bitter cold burns through the body's reserves at a startling rate, and few things restore warmth from the inside quite as effectively or as comfortingly as hot food eaten together at the end of a long day. The Scandinavian winter table, it has to be said honestly, was not a place of variety or extravagance. What it offered instead was consistency, nourishment, and a kind of deep, practiced reliability, because everything eaten through the winter months had to have been preserved, stored, or grown in a way that could survive the season without spoiling, and that single constraint shaped the entire cuisine into something remarkably well suited to exactly the conditions it had to serve. Grain porridge sat at the heart of countless winter meals made from oats, barley, or rye, depending on the region and the year's harvest, cooked slowly over the fire in a heavy pot until thick, often served with a small, treasured pat of butter melting into the centre, or a spoonful of preserved berries, lingonberries especially, whose sharp tartness had been captured and held through the autumn specifically for moments exactly like this one. This porridge, unglamorous as it sounds, was genuinely well suited to the evening's needs. It was filling, it was warm, from the very first spoonful to the last, and it reheated easily the following morning from whatever was left in the pot. An efficient use of both fuel and effort in a household where both were precious. Preserved fish featured heavily too, particularly along the coasts and around the Great Lakes, where herring, cod, or salmon caught and salted, smoked, or dried during more abundant months became a reliable protein source through winter's leaner stretch. A piece of salted fish soaked to draw some of the salt back out, then gently cooked, paired naturally with the dense, dark rye bread that was another absolute staple of the Scandinavian winter table, bread baked in large batches, and sometimes deliberately left to dry into hard, long-lasting flatbread knäckebröd that could be stored for weeks or months without spoiling, exactly the kind of practical foresight that shaped so much of this entire way of life. Root vegetables rounded things out where they could be kept, turnips, carrots, cabbage, stored in cool cellars dug beneath or beside the cabin specifically to hold produce at a stable temperature through the freeze outside. And these would go into thick, simple stews alongside whatever preserved meat the household had managed to lay in, pork most commonly, salted or smoked in autumn specifically to last the winter through. And The cooking of all this, slow, unhurried, done directly over or beside the same fire that was warming the room, became its own quiet centerpiece of the evening, the smell of it filling the small space long before the meal was actually ready. Everyone in the room gradually drawn back toward the stove, not just for warmth now, but in simple, honest anticipation. There is something worth sitting with in this image, a single fire doing double duty, warming the bodies and cooking the food of an entire household at once, no separate systems, no separate rooms, everything looping back to that one glowing, carefully tended centre. Eating together in this single main room by firelight wasn't merely efficient. It was, most evenings, the one point in the day when the whole household properly reconvened, parents and children and perhaps a grandparent or two. Everyone finally still after a day spent largely in motion or in separate tasks. And it's in that stillness, gathered close around simple hot food in a small warm room, while an entire brutal winter pressed harmlessly against thick walls just beyond the firelight, that the evening now settles into its quieter, gentler hours, the mending, the stories, the slow, unhurried drift of a family toward sleep. Once the pot had been scraped clean and set aside, the household didn't simply scatter to separate corners the way we might after dinner today. There wasn't really room for that, for one thing, but more than that, there wasn't much reason for it either. The main room, warm now, well lit by firelight and perhaps a small tallow candle or two, or in slightly more prosperous households an oil lamp burning fish or seal oil in the coastal regions, remained the natural centre of gravity for whatever hours were left before sleep, and everyone tended to stay within its warm circle, occupied with small, quiet tasks that could be done by low light and without much need to move around. This was, more than almost any other part of the day, the hour of mending. Wool, as durable and essential as it was to surviving the winter, wore through constantly, at elbows, at heels, at the knees of children who spent their days clambering over wood piles and snowdrifts, despite every instruction not to. And so the evening's firelight often illuminated a household deep in quiet repair, a mother or grandmother working a needle through a sock heel, gone thin, turning a worn shirt collar, patching a mittened thumb before the cold could find its way through the gap. This wasn't drudgery exactly, or at least it doesn't seem to have been experienced that way. It was simply the steady, unhurried maintenance that kept an entire winter's wardrobe functional, done in company, by firelight, often while conversation moved easily around the room. Spinning, too, filled countless winter evenings, particularly in households that raised their own sheep, as so many did across the rural north. A drop spindle or a spinning wheel, if the household was fortunate enough to own one, turned raw fleece into usable yarn hour after patient hour, wool that would eventually become next winter's mittens, next winter's socks, the raw material of the household's entire defence against the cold being quite literally spun into existence by firelight, while the current winter's cold pressed against the walls outside. There's something worth noticing in this too, a kind of continuous loop running through the whole system. The wool that kept you warm this winter had been spun and knitted the winter before by the same hands, in the same room, by the same fire, an unbroken chain of preparation stretching backward and forward through every year of a family's life on that farm. Carving filled the hours for others in the household, particularly for men and older boys, working wood into spoons, bowls, tool handles, sometimes small toys for younger children, useful items produced steadily and without waste from a material the forest provided freely and which, unlike so much else on a winter farm, wasn't rationed by scarcity. A knife, a block of birch or pine, and the low, steady light of the stove were enough to occupy careful hands for hours, and the resulting items, plain and functional as most of them were, represented real, valuable additions to a household stock of tools and goods made during exactly the hours when outdoor work simply wasn't possible. And running underneath all of this quiet, occupied activity, filling the room the way the firelight did, was talk. Storytelling held an especially treasured place in Scandinavian winter evenings, and it's easy to understand why once you consider the sheer quantity of dark, enclosed hours a family had to fill together through the coldest months. Folk tales passed down through generations found their most natural home exactly here, told by firelight to children whose eyes had likely already begun to grow heavy, tales of trolls lurking in the deep forest beyond the farm's cleared fields, of the household Nissa who watched over barn and byre and expected to be treated with proper respect and the occasional bowl of porridge left out on his behalf, of clever farmers outwitting dangerous creatures through wit rather than force, stories shaped over centuries specifically to be told in rooms exactly like this one, at exactly this hour to audiences exactly this tired and exactly this ready to be gently frightened and then just as gently reassured. Older members of the household, grandparents especially where they lived within the same home, often carried the bulk of this storytelling responsibility. And it's worth pausing on what a genuinely important role that was within the whole structure of winter survival, even though nobody would have described it in such practical terms at the time. Children needed to be occupied through long, dark, enclosed evenings, needed some outlet for imagination and attention that didn't require moving around in a small room already crowded with mending and spinning and the careful, banked heat of the fire, and story after story provided exactly that, hour after hour, night after night. An entertainment system requiring no fuel and no light, beyond what the fire was already providing anyway. Music, where a household had it, added its own texture to these evenings, a simple stringed instrument, perhaps, or voices alone carrying old ballads and hymns that had been passed down as thoroughly as the folk tales themselves, songs about the changing seasons, about love and loss, about the long journey of a Nordic year from the brief bright warmth of summer back around to exactly this kind of deep midwinter evening. There is a particular kind of comfort in a shared song sung quietly in a small warm room while wind works at the eaves outside, a sense of the household drawing its boundaries a little more firmly around itself, a little more warmly with every verse. As the evening wore on, and it's worth remembering that with daylight scarce and darkness beginning as early as mid-afternoon in the depths of winter, evenings up here genuinely were long. The pace of the room would naturally begin to slow. Conversation grew quieter, more sporadic. The mending in hand grew less urgent, worked at more slowly, sometimes set aside half-finished for tomorrow. Younger children, worn down by the day and lulled by firelight and story, often drifted towards sleep well before the adults did, curling into whatever warm corner or shared bed had been prepared for them, sometimes right there by the stove itself if the household's sleeping arrangements allowed it, close enough to the fire's warmth to drift off without ever really feeling the transition from waking to sleeping at all. There was rarely any strict, formal bedtime in the way we might think of one today. No fixed hour announced and enforced. Instead, the household simply wound down together, gradually, task by task, until enough of the room had grown quiet and still that it became clear the evening had, without anyone declaring it outright, arrived at its natural close. Someone would check the fire one final time, adjusting the banked coals, ensuring the careful balance of heat and containment that would need to hold steady, untended, for the many hours of night still ahead. Candles or the lamp would be extinguished one by one until only the fire's low, steady glow remained, casting the room into the same warm dimness it had carried since dusk, and the household gathered so closely and so completely into this one small, defended space against an entire dark, freezing world outside would finally begin the last and most important task of the evening. Settling properly into bed, layered in wool and fur against a night that the fire alone, however carefully tended, could only do so much to fight on its own. And that quiet, deliberate business of preparing for sleep itself, the wool, the layering, the shared warmth of bodies pressed close in a single bed against a Nordic winter night, is exactly where we'll pick things up when we return. Sleep, in a Scandinavian farmhouse in the depths of winter, was never a matter of simply lying down and hoping for the best. It was, like everything else we've walked through tonight, a carefully assembled system, built layer by layer out of materials the household had spent the better part of the year preparing specifically for this purpose, and understanding it properly means understanding wool first. Because wool is really the quiet hero of this entire story. Sheep were kept across nearly every part of rural Scandinavia specifically because wool performed so well in exactly these conditions, and the households living through these winters understood its properties with a precision that modern outdoor gear companies would recognize immediately. Wool holds a remarkable amount of trapped air within its fibers, and it's that trapped air, not the wool itself, that actually does the insulating. The same basic principle behind a modern down jacket or a double-glazed window. Critically, wool also continues to insulate even when damp, unlike cotton or linen, which lose most of their warming ability the moment moisture gets into them, and in a climate where a body might come in from outside carrying snow that would inevitably melt against warm skin. This property mattered enormously. Every part of the winter bed reflected this understanding. The mattress itself in most working farm households wasn't the soft, sprung thing we'd recognize today. It was typically a cloth casing, often coarse linen or hemp, densely stuffed with straw, sometimes dried heather or moss in regions where straw was scarcer, replaced or refreshed at the start of each season when the previous fill had compacted down and lost its loft. Straw performed a genuinely useful function here, beyond simple cushioning. Like wool, it trapped air within its hollow stems, creating a layer of insulation directly beneath the sleeper, between the body and whatever cold surface, wooden bed frame, or even packed earth floor, in the oldest and humblest cabins lay underneath. Sleeping directly on a cold surface all night would have drawn heat away from the body relentlessly, and this straw layer existed specifically to prevent exactly that. Above the straw mattress came sheepskins, whole fleeces, tanned and cured, laid fur side up, providing another dense layer of trapped air directly against the body, along with a soft, thick surface that made the whole arrangement considerably more comfortable than the straw alone would have been. Wealthier households, or those with particularly successful flocks, might layer several sheepskins for the coldest months, while more modest homes made do with fewer, supplementing with whatever additional wool blankets the household had managed to weave or felt over the preceding year. And then came the blankets and coverings themselves, thick, densely woven wool, sometimes felted further to close up any remaining gaps between fibres and make the fabric even more wind and draft resistant. In many households, a particular kind of woven wool coverlet called a raya held special importance. Thick, shaggy pile blankets originally developed, quite tellingly, specifically as bedding to survive harsh Nordic winters, before they later evolved into the decorative wall hangings and rugs some might recognize the name from today. A good raya, heavy with long wool pile, could hold an extraordinary amount of warmth, and families often invested real time and skill into weaving the finest ones they could manage, understanding perfectly well that the difference between an adequate blanket and an excellent one might genuinely matter on the coldest nights of the year. Layering technique mattered here just as much as it had for outdoor clothing earlier in the evening. Rather than one enormously thick single blanket, most households built up several thinner layers, each trapping its own pocket of warmed air, with the heaviest, densest covering placed on top. This approach, several moderate layers rather than one massive one, allowed the sleeper to adjust through the night as needed, and also meant that if one layer became slightly damp from breath or condensation, the whole system didn't fail at once the way a single, sodden blanket might. Where the sleeping space itself was concerned, many older Scandinavian cabins used what's often called a box bed or alcove bed, a sleeping space built directly into the wall or corner of the main room, sometimes with wooden doors or curtains that could be drawn nearly shut, creating a small enclosed pocket of space considerably warmer than the open room around it. This design solved a genuinely clever problem, heating an entire large room to a comfortable sleeping temperature all night, every night, through months of brutal cold would have demanded an enormous, unsustainable amount of fuel. But a small, enclosed, sleeping alcove, warmed initially by proximity to the stove and then further warmed simply by the body heat of whoever slept inside it, retained warmth far more efficiently, a smaller volume of air being vastly easier to keep comfortable than the whole stew. This is also where the practice of shared sleeping becomes worth understanding properly, because it wasn't merely about space constraints in a modest cabin, real as those constraints often were. Sharing a bed, whether between spouses, between siblings, or between parents and younger children, meant sharing body heat directly, each person effectively becoming a small additional heat source for the others, and in genuinely cold conditions, this made a measurable, meaningful difference to how warm and how well anyone actually slept through the night. Households arranged this deliberately and sensibly. Younger children often slept closest to parents or grandparents, specifically because they lost heat fastest relative to their body size, and the smallest infants, in the coldest weather, might even be kept remarkably close to the banked embers themselves, in a cradle positioned near enough to the stove's radiant warmth to benefit directly from it without any risk from the coals themselves. Night clothes added their own layer to this whole careful system, typically simple, loose woolen garments, a nightshirt or nightgown, sometimes a woolen cap worn specifically to bed, following the same sound logic that would show up independently in plenty of other cold climates across history, that a surprising amount of body heat is lost through an uncovered head, and a simple wool cap made a genuinely noticeable difference to overall warmth through a long, still night. Wool stockings, too, were commonly kept on through the night in the coldest months, feet being both particularly vulnerable to cold and particularly difficult to rewarm quickly once they'd gone properly chilled. Some households employed one further clever trick worth mentioning, a stone or a specially made ceramic or metal container, warmed near the fire through the evening, then wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed shortly before anyone climbed in, providing a small pocket of direct warmth exactly where cold tends to settle first and linger longest against the body. It's a small detail, almost domestic in scale, but it speaks to the same underlying philosophy running through every choice we've examined tonight. Nothing about staying warm through a Nordic winter night was left to chance or hope. Every layer, every material, every small object pressed into service was chosen and positioned with real, practical understanding of exactly how heat moves and how it's lost, refined across generations of families who simply couldn't afford to get it wrong. With the bed properly built up, layer upon careful layer, and the room's remaining light reduced now to nothing but the stove's low glow, the household would finally begin the actual business of settling in for the night, and this transition, too, followed its own familiar, comfortable rhythm. Children, often already drowsy from the evening's stories and the day's outdoor exertion, were usually first to be tucked properly into their sleeping spaces, parents or older siblings helping arrange the wool coverings snugly, checking that small feet were adequately covered, offering whatever quiet reassurance a child might need before actual sleep arrived, a final soft word, perhaps a hand rested briefly against a small shoulder in the near dark. In households that kept to it, a brief evening prayer or blessing often marked this moment, whispered quietly in the low light. Less an elaborate ritual than a simple, quiet acknowledgement of the day's end and a hope, spoken or merely felt, for a safe and warm passage through the night ahead. The adults of the household followed shortly after, though not always immediately, because someone typically remained sitting a little longer by the stove, tending to that final, most important task of the whole evening, one we touched on earlier, but which deserves a proper moment of its own here. The last banking of the fire before the household truly settled for the night was done with particular care, because this fire, more than any lit earlier in the day, needed to hold steady and safe through 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours with absolutely no one awake to watch it. Coals were raked into their most compact, efficient shape, ash mounded carefully over the top in exactly the right measure, thick enough to slow the burn to a bare, safe smoulder, but never so thick as to smother the coals into true cold ash by morning. Whoever performed this task, often the head of household or whoever in the family had proven themselves most reliably skilled at it, would typically check the hearth surrounds one final time, ensuring nothing flammable sat too near, that the stone or brick hearthstones were properly positioned, that the whole arrangement was as safe as careful hands could make it, before finally turning away and joining the rest of the family in the enclosed warmth of the sleeping alcove, and then, at last, quiet. The candle or lamp long since extinguished, the room lit only by the faint orange seam of light escaping the stove's damper, the whole household settled close together beneath their careful layers of wool and fur, breathing slowing, the day's cold and effort finally receding into the deep, unhurried rest that a genuinely well-prepared winter household had earned for itself. Outside, beyond the thick log walls and the small shuttered windows, the Nordic winter night continued exactly as it had every night before, and would every night after, vast, dark, and indifferent, wind moving steadily across the snow, temperatures dropping further still as the night wore on toward its coldest hour, just before dawn. But inside, in this one small, carefully engineered pocket of warmth, none of that mattered nearly as much as it should have. And it's into that deep, settled quiet, into the long, dark middle stretch of the night itself that we'll move next, listening to exactly what a Scandinavian winter night actually sounded like from inside a warm cabin, and understanding what, if anything, ever disturbed that hard-won rest before morning finally arrived. A cabin at night in the depths of a Nordic winter was never entirely silent, and that's worth sitting with for a moment, because silence is often what we imagine when we picture this kind of deep, isolated stillness. The reality was quieter than the daytime world, certainly, but it was a living, textured quiet, full of small sounds that anyone raised in this environment would have learned to read almost without noticing, sounds that told a practiced ear a great deal about exactly what kind of night it was turning out to be. The wind was almost always present in some form, sometimes a low, steady hum, working at the eaves and the corners of the roof, sometimes rising into sharper gusts that pressed audibly against the shuttered windows, occasionally, on the fiercest nights, building into something closer to a continuous roar that made the whole cabin feel small and precious against the scale of what was happening outside it. Log walls, for all their thickness and careful construction, were not entirely soundproof, and the particular voice of wind moving across open snow, thin and keening in the coldest, driest conditions, carried through those walls in a way that became, over enough winters, less alarming and more simply familiar background texture to a household's rest, rather than any real cause for alarm. Timber itself made its own quiet contributions to the night's soundscape. Wood expands and contracts with temperature, and a log cabin experiencing a sharp overnight temperature drop, common on the clearest, coldest nights, when cloud cover wasn't present to hold any of the day's modest warmth close to the ground, would often produce a series of sharp cracks and low groans as the logs settled and shifted fractionally against one another. To an unfamiliar ear, this might sound alarming, but to anyone who'd grown up in one of these homes, it was simply the sound a cabin made on a particularly cold night. No different really from a modern homeowner learning to recognize their own house's particular creaks and settles, and in time it likely became almost reassuring in its familiarity, evidence that the temperature had indeed dropped further, which meant the household's preparations that evening had mattered all the more. Snow itself, falling steadily through a long winter night, produced barely any sound at all reaching indoors, but its accumulation had its own quiet effects on the household's rest. A thick blanket of fresh snow against the outer walls and piled deep against the base of the cabin actually improved the building's insulation further still, snow being somewhat counterintuitively a genuinely effective insulator itself due to the enormous amount of trapped air held within its structure, not unlike wool in that basic respect. A cabin drifted deep with snow on its northernmost wind-exposed side was, in a strange way, slightly better protected against that wind than one left bare, and older households understood this well enough that snow piled naturally against the walls was rarely something anyone rushed to clear away in the depths of winter, left instead to do its own quiet additional insulating work until spring. Occasionally, the deeper stillness of the night was broken by something requiring actual attention, and this is worth acknowledging honestly, rather than presenting the whole night as uninterrupted, peaceful rest, because it generally wasn't, not completely. A particularly cold night, or a fire that had been banked slightly imperfectly, might mean someone in the household woke part way through the night's coldest hours to find the room's temperature had dropped further than comfortable, and a brief, half-asleep trip to the hearth to add a little more wood or adjust the damper wasn't uncommon. Done quickly and quietly in the dark by feel and long familiarity rather than by any real deliberate wakefulness, before returning gratefully to the warmth of shared bedding. Livestock, too, occasionally required a middle-of-the-night check during the harshest storms, particularly around lambing or calving season, regardless of how bitter the weather happened to be, though in deep midwinter this was less common than in the shoulder seasons, and beyond the practical there were the sounds and sights that belonged more properly to wonder than to worry. On especially clear nights, particularly in the more northern reaches of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the aurora borealis might paint the sky above the cabin in slow, shifting curtains of green and sometimes red or violet light, visible through the smallest gap in a window shutter, or glimpsed by whoever stepped briefly outside to check on the woodpile or the animals before finally turning in. Old folklore across the region offered various explanations for these northern lights, sometimes tied to ancestral spirits, sometimes to more ominous warnings, but whatever meaning any particular family attached to it, the sight of the aurora moving silently above a snow-covered valley, above a small cluster of warm, smoke-curling cabins holding their quiet ground against the vast winter dark, must have been a genuinely beautiful, humbling thing to witness, a reminder of just how small and precious this whole careful system of warmth and shelter really was, against the enormous scale of the world surrounding it. Through all of this, the wind, and the creaking timber, and the deep, star-sharp cold pressing down outside, the household inside continued its slow, steady rest, wrapped in wool, warmed by banked coals and by each other, drifting through the long hours of a winter night that would eventually, however slowly it seemed to move, give way once again to the thin grey beginning of another short winter day. And it's to that turning point, the quiet stirring of a household waking into the cold, dim hours before a Nordic winter dawn, that we'll turn our attention next. Morning in the deepest part of a Scandinavian winter arrived slowly and reluctantly, and it rarely announced itself the way we might expect. There was no sudden brightening, no clean line between night and day, the way summer mornings offer further south. Instead, the darkness simply thinned, gradually. Over the course of an hour or more, the sky outside the small, shuttered windows shifting from true black to a deep, bruised blue, then finally to the pale, low grey that counted as full daylight for perhaps 5 or 6 hours before the whole slow process reversed itself again that same afternoon. Waking inside the cabin followed its own familiar pattern, shaped almost entirely around the fire, because the fire was, once again, the very first order of business, exactly as it had been the very last thing tended the night before. Whoever woke first, often the same person who'd banked the coals the previous evening, would rise quietly, while the rest of the household still lay warm beneath their layered wool, and make their way, usually in bare or stockinged feet across a floor that had gone properly cold overnight, toward the hearth. This moment, cold feet against a cold floor in a dim room where your own breath was likely visible in the low light, was probably the single least comfortable part of the entire daily cycle, and it's worth acknowledging honestly, rather than pretending the whole system was seamless comfort from evening to morning. The room, even with a well-banked fire, inevitably lost some warmth over 8 or 9 hours of a genuinely brutal winter night, and stepping out from beneath thick wool and fur into that noticeably cooler air took a kind of quiet, practiced resolve that anyone who's ever left a warm bed on a cold morning will recognize instantly. Just turned up considerably in intensity. But the reward for that discomfort came quickly, because uncovering the banked coals from the night before and finding them still glowing, still holding real heat after so many hours untended, was a small daily victory, proof that the previous evening's careful work had paid off exactly as intended. Fresh kindling went onto those coals first, thin, dry, quick-catching wood, coaxed gently rather than dumped on carelessly, and within a few minutes a proper flame would catch, then grow, then finally accept the thicker logs that would build the fire back up toward the heat needed for cooking and for driving the worst of the overnight chill back out of the room. As the fire rebuilt itself, the rest of the household would typically begin to stir, drawn partly by the sound of the fire being tended, and partly simply by the accumulated habit of rising at roughly this hour, whatever the actual position of the sun happened to be. Children were often allowed to linger a few extra minutes beneath the warm wool while the room slowly reheated around them, a small kindness that cost nothing and made the transition from sleep considerably gentler. Breakfast, when it came, tended toward the same steady, reliable fare as the previous evening's meal, often literally the same porridge, reheated from the pot, perhaps with a little more milk or butter stirred through if the household's dairy cow was still producing through the winter months, which not all were. And then, daylight being the precious, rationed resource it was through these months, the household would move fairly quickly into whatever work the day demanded, because 5 or 6 hours of usable light genuinely wasn't much time to accomplish everything that needed doing before darkness closed in again. This was the fundamental rhythm of the entire season, really, a whole culture organized around the stark reality that darkness vastly outweighed daylight for months on end, and every household's entire pattern of living, working, eating, and resting had been shaped, generation after generation, to fit neatly within that unforgiving arithmetic. It's worth pausing here to widen our view a little, because everything we've walked through so far has centred on a fairly typical rural farmstead, the kind of household that made up the majority of the Scandinavian countryside through these centuries. But winter in this part of the world took other forms too, and one of the most remarkable belongs to the Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of the far north, whose traditional way of life, built around reindeer herding across the vast Arctic reaches of Sapmi, spanning northern Norway, Sweden, Finland and Russia, demanded an entirely different, equally sophisticated approach to surviving the same brutal winters. Where a farming family stayed largely in one fixed cabin through the season, many Sami communities historically followed their reindeer herds across considerable distances, even through winter, which meant their winter shelters needed to be more readily assembled, moved and rebuilt than a permanent log structure could ever be. The lavu, a conical tent structure built around a frame of long wooden poles and traditionally covered in reindeer hide, offered a genuinely brilliant solution to this problem, portable enough to move with the herd, yet, when properly built and covered, remarkably effective at holding warmth against extreme Arctic cold. The genius of the lavu lay largely in its shape and its fire. A small hearth burned at the very centre of the tent, its smoke rising and escaping through a controlled opening at the peak, and the conical form itself created a natural, efficient circulation of warm air throughout the interior space, while the reindeer hide covering, dense with the same kind of insulating trapped air that made wool so effective, held that warmth in remarkably well despite the structure's relatively lightweight, portable construction. Sleeping arrangements inside followed familiar underlying logic too, thick reindeer hides laid as ground insulation. The family gathered close around the central fire, body heat shared deliberately just as it was in the farmhouses further south. For more settled winter habitation, some Sami communities also built the goati, a similar conical or sometimes more rounded structure but built with a sturdier frame and often covered with turf, or a combination of timber and sod rather than hide, intended to stand through an entire season rather than being broken down and moved as frequently. This structure shared clear, philosophical common ground with the log cabins we spent so much of tonight's journey inside, thick insulating material, careful fire management at the centre of daily and nightly life, a design built entirely around holding a small pocket of viable warmth against an environment that offered absolutely no natural warmth of its own for months on end. What's genuinely striking, looking at these different traditions side by side, farming cabin and reindeer herders lavu alike, is how consistently the same underlying principles reassert themselves regardless of the specific materials or lifestyle involved. Thick insulation exploiting trapped air, whether in log walls, wool blankets, or reindeer hide. A central fire tended with real skill and respect, around which the whole rhythm of evening and night organized itself. Bodies gathered close together, sharing warmth deliberately, rather than leaving it to chance. Across an entire diverse region spanning settled farmers and nomadic herders alike, winter had taught everyone independently and yet somehow identically the exact same fundamental lessons about how to stay alive and reasonably comfortable through months of relentless, cold and dark. Isolation, as thorough as it often was for any single household through the depths of winter, wasn't total, and it's worth spending a little time on the moments when the wider community did manage to draw together, despite the season's best efforts to keep everyone apart. Winter markets held a particularly important place in this rhythm, especially in Sweden and Finland, where frozen rivers and lakes, treacherous in other seasons, actually became reliable, solid highways once properly frozen through, allowing sledges laden with goods to travel distances that would have been far more difficult across the same terrain in summer's mud and undergrowth. Farmers might travel considerable distances by sledge specifically to reach these markets, trading surplus goods, salted fish, furs, handcrafted wooden items for whatever their own household lacked. And these gatherings offered a genuinely welcome break from the isolation of the farmstead, a chance to exchange news, see distant relatives or friends, and remind oneself that the wider world hadn't simply vanished behind the snow. Church attendance, where distance and weather allowed it, served a similar unifying function. Families bundling into sledges for the journey to whatever church served their parish, the gathering afterward often as socially important as the service itself, an opportunity for neighbours who might not see one another for weeks at a stretch to properly catch up. And Christmas, or Jul as it's known across much of the region, arrived at nearly the very darkest point of the entire year, a timing that feels almost too perfectly suited to its purpose, a celebration of light and warmth and togetherness, deliberately placed at precisely the moment the natural world offered the least of either. Households prepared for weeks in advance, extra food set aside specifically for the occasion, candles burned more generously than the usual careful winter rationing allowed, and for a few precious days the deep isolation of the season gave way to genuine celebration, extended family gathering where distance permitted, old traditions around light and fire taking on their fullest, most deliberate expression exactly when the household most needed reminding that spring, however distant it still felt, was genuinely coming. It's difficult to walk through everything we've covered tonight, the cabins built log by careful log against the cold, the fires tended with such patient, practiced skill, the wool spun and woven a full year, in advance of the winter it would eventually warm, without noticing how directly this entire way of living connects to ideas that have travelled well beyond Scandinavia in recent years. The Danish concept of hygge and its close Norwegian cousin kosselig have become almost fashionable shorthand internationally for a particular kind of cosy, candlelit contentment, thick sweaters and warm drinks and gathered friends against a cold evening outside. And there's real truth underneath the trend, because these concepts didn't emerge from nowhere. They grew directly out of centuries of exactly the lived experience we've spent this whole video exploring. Households who genuinely needed to find warmth, comfort, and connection indoors through months of brutal, unforgiving darkness, and who gradually built an entire cultural sensibility, a whole aesthetic and emotional language around doing exactly that as well and as gracefully as possible. There's a lesson in that worth sitting with as we bring tonight's journey to its close, something that feels true regardless of century or circumstance. Given genuinely difficult conditions, cold, dark, isolation, scarcity, people don't simply endure. Given enough time and enough generations of careful attention, they build systems, rituals, and quiet daily competencies that turn hardship into something closer to rhythm, even comfort, even a kind of hard-won beauty. The Scandinavian winter cabin, log walls thick against the cold, stove glowing steady through the dark hours, family gathered close beneath layered wool while wind worked harmlessly at the eaves outside, stands as a genuinely lovely example of exactly that, a whole, careful, patient civilization's answer to one of the harshest environments on Earth, built not from grand technology, but from wood and wool and fire, and the simple, steady willingness to tend to one another night after night, until spring finally, eventually, found its way back. We've spent a great deal of tonight's journey talking about wool as though it simply appeared, ready-made, whenever a household needed it, folded neatly into blankets and stockings and the thick coverlets piled onto every winter bed. It's worth slowing down now and looking properly at where all of that wool actually came from, because the process behind it was, itself, a quiet, year-round undertaking every bit as demanding and deliberate as anything we've covered so far. And it tells you a great deal about just how far in advance these households had to think in order for any single winter evening to unfold as smoothly as it did. The work began, in a very real sense, the previous spring, with shearing. Sheep kept across the Scandinavian countryside were typically sheared once, sometimes twice a year, and the timing of this task mattered enormously. Done too early, and the animals risked exposure to a late, cold snap. Done too late, and the wool itself lost some of its quality as the sheep's coat continued to grow past its prime condition. Shearing by hand using simple blade shears rather than any mechanized tool was slow, careful work, and a household with even a modest flock might spend the better part of several days at it, fleece after fleece coming away in one continuous piece if the shearer was skilled, then set aside for the processing that would occupy the household, on and off, for months afterward. Raw fleece, straight off the sheep, was a genuinely unglamorous starting material, heavy with natural oils, dirt, and bits of straw and vegetation picked up over months of grazing. Washing it properly, without stripping away too much of the natural lanolin that helped make the finished wool water resistant, was its own small art, usually done in large quantities near a stream or with heated water, carried specifically for the purpose, then laid out to dry, ideally on a clear day. Though clear days suitable for this kind of outdoor drying work were hardly guaranteed even in a Scandinavian summer. Once dry, the wool needed carding, a process of combing the fibres repeatedly between two flat paddles studded with fine wire teeth, until the previously tangled, matted fleece became a smooth, aligned mass of fibre ready to be spun. This was often work done by hand evening after evening, sometimes by children old enough to manage the repetitive motion, but not yet skilled enough for finer tasks. A genuinely useful contribution a household could extract from its younger members without requiring much training at all. Carded wool, light and airy, compared to the raw fleece it started as, was then ready for the spindle or the wheel, the very same spinning we touched on earlier tonight, transforming loose fibre into continuous, usable thread or yarn. Dyeing, where a household chose to colour their wool rather than leaving it in its natural cream, grey or brown, drew on whatever plants, lichens, bark, and occasionally insects the surrounding landscape offered up. Birch leaves produced a soft, yellow. Certain lichens, painstakingly gathered from rocks and tree bark, yielded a range of colours from gold through a deep, rich red, depending on the species and the exact process used. Indigo, imported and therefore genuinely valuable, produced the deep blues that show up so often in traditional Scandinavian folk costume, a colour worth real effort and expense precisely because it couldn't be produced locally the way the more muted earth tones could. This dyeing, when it happened at all, was typically done in a single large batch sometime in summer or early autumn. Well before the wool was actually needed, one more task on the long list of preparations quietly completed months ahead of the winter they were ultimately intended to serve. Only after all of this, the shearing, the washing, the carding, the spinning, and sometimes the dyeing, did wool finally become the material a household could actually weave into blankets, knit into stockings and mittens, or felt into the dense, wind-resistant fabric used for outer garments. Weaving, done on a standing loom in households that owned one, or through simpler techniques where they didn't, produced the broader cloth used for blankets and the heavier raya coverlets we discussed earlier. Knitting, portable, and requiring nothing more than needles and a ball of yarn, filled countless quiet hours, evenings, and even moments snatched during the day. A woman walking between tasks with knitting needles moving steadily in her hands, socks and mittens accumulating steadily across an entire year in preparation for a season that would demand every single one of them. It's worth genuinely appreciating the scale of foresight embedded in all of this. Every mitten warming a child's hand on a January morning represented hours of unseen labour stretching back the better part of a year. Sheep sheared in spring sunlight, fleece washed and dried through summer, carded and spun through long autumn evenings, finally knitted into shape sometime before the first hard frost arrived. Nothing about the comfortable wool-wrapped winter evenings we've spent so much of tonight inside happened by accident or convenience. It was the visible endpoint of an entire year's quiet, patient labour, invisible now except in the finished warmth it provided, exactly when it was needed most. Water too demanded far more deliberate effort in winter than it likely does in whatever kitchen you're falling asleep near tonight, and it's worth understanding this part of the daily routine properly because it shaped the practical rhythm of a winter household just as thoroughly as fire and wool did. Wells, where a farm had one, often froze at least partially through the coldest stretches, and drawing water became a task requiring real physical effort, breaking through a skin of ice that might reform within hours if temperatures stayed low enough, hauling heavy buckets back across snow and ice to the house, work usually assigned early in the day before the cold had fully set back in from the previous night. Households without a reliable well, or during periods when an existing well had frozen too solidly to use, often turned to snow and ice itself as their water source, an option that sounds simple enough until you understand the actual physics involved. Melting snow for water is considerably less efficient than it seems, requiring a genuinely large volume of snow to produce a comparatively modest amount of liquid water, and doing this over a fire that was already working hard to heat the room and cook the evening meal represented a real additional demand on the household's fuel supply. Ice, cut directly from a frozen lake or river in blocks and brought inside to melt, tended to be somewhat more efficient than loose snow, denser, and requiring less volume for the same eventual yield, and many farms positioned near open water made a point of harvesting and storing ice specifically for this purpose, sometimes packed in sawdust or straw in a shaded outbuilding where it might last well into the following season if properly insulated. Frozen rivers and lakes, treacherous as they could be if misjudged, also became genuinely valuable infrastructure once properly frozen through to a safe depth, offering a flat, solid surface considerably easier to travel across by sledge than the deep, uneven snow covering the surrounding countryside. Households living near these frozen waterways often relied on them as a kind of seasonal road system, connecting farms and villages that might otherwise have felt considerably more cut off from one another through the winter months. One more example of this entire culture's remarkable talent for turning the season's harshest features into something genuinely useful, rather than simply enduring them. Illness, inevitably, arrived sometimes despite every careful precaution a household took against the cold, and dealing with it through a long isolated winter demanded its own body of accumulated knowledge, passed down much the same way fire tending and woolworking skills were, from grandmother to mother to daughter, refined across generations of genuine necessity. With professional medical help often days away even in reasonable weather, and entirely unreachable during a serious storm, households relied heavily on herbal remedies gathered and dried the previous summer specifically for this purpose. Chamomile and elderflower for fevers and coughs, various barks and roots steeped into teas believed to ease particular ailments, and a deep, practical understanding of which common household plants and stores could double as medicine when genuinely needed. Midwifery, too, existed almost entirely outside any formal medical structure across most of the rural Scandinavian countryside. An experienced woman within the community, sometimes, but not always a relative, called upon whenever a birth approached, her knowledge built entirely from experience and from whatever had been passed to her by the midwife who came before. A birth timed, unfortunately, arriving in the depths of a serious winter storm with the nearest experienced help genuinely unreachable, represented one of the real, honest dangers underlying this whole otherwise cozy, carefully managed picture of winter cabin life, and it's worth acknowledging that honestly here rather than glossing past it. This was a genuinely hard existence in real ways, and the warmth and comfort we've spent tonight admiring existed specifically because it had to, because the alternative, when preparation or luck failed, could be genuinely serious. And so households treated prevention with the seriousness it deserved, keeping warm and dry as the first and most important line of defense against illness generally, understanding well enough, even without any formal germ theory to explain it, that a body kept properly warm and properly fed through the winter stood a far better chance of avoiding sickness altogether than one left cold, damp, or exhausted. In this sense, everything we've walked through tonight, the careful cabin construction, the patient fire tending, the layered wool, the reliable hot food, wasn't merely about comfort for its own sake. It was, quite directly, a matter of health and survival, comfort and safety being, in this particular world, very nearly the same thing. The forest surrounding these farmsteads deserves its own proper attention too, because it was never simply scenery, a dark backdrop pressing against the edges of cleared farmland. It was an active, essential resource, providing not just the firewood we've already discussed at length, but game as well. Households supplementing their stored winter provisions wherever possible with hare, grouse, and, where the land and local custom allowed it, occasionally larger game like elk, hunted through the autumn specifically to be salted, smoked, or frozen for winter use. Hunting through the winter months itself continued in more limited fashion too, snares set for hare in particular proving a reliable low-effort way to supplement the table even during the coldest stretches, checked on the same trips out to the woodpile or the animal shelter that already needed making regardless. Foraging, too, had its own careful seasonal calendar, feeding directly into winter's needs. Mushrooms dried in autumn, added dried to winter stews for both flavour and nutrition. Berries, lingonberries especially, gathered in enormous quantities during their brief late summer season and preserved, specifically to last the full winter through, providing not just flavour, but a genuinely valuable source of vitamin C through months when fresh fruit and vegetables were entirely unavailable, an unglamorous but genuinely important piece of keeping an isolated household healthy across a season, with essentially no fresh produce to speak of. Children, finally, occupied a particular place in all of this that's worth understanding properly before we close things out tonight, because winter for the youngest members of these households wasn't purely hardship. Whatever the very real dangers and discomforts we've discussed elsewhere tonight, formal schooling, where it existed at all in the more rural stretches of the Scandinavian countryside, was often genuinely difficult to maintain through the depths of winter, distances to any schoolhouse simply too far, and conditions too dangerous for regular daily travel, and so a good deal of a child's actual education through these months happened at home instead. Practical skills, reading where a household possessed the ability and the books to teach it, and above all, the same slow, patient absorption of fire tending, woolworking, and household management that would serve them for the rest of their own adult lives. But there was play too, genuine and important, snow offering its own particular kind of entertainment that children across this landscape have clearly enjoyed across countless generations. Simple wooden sledges, sometimes home-built, carried children down whatever modest slope the local landscape offered. Snow itself became building material for forts and rough figures, skiing, an activity with genuinely ancient roots across this exact region, long predating anything resembling recreational winter sport as we'd recognise it today, was for many children simply the most practical way to move any real distance across deep snow, learned early and used constantly. Transportation and play blurring together in exactly the kind of practical, resourceful way that seems to characterize this entire culture's relationship with its own harsh season. It's this fuller picture, taken all together, the wool spun a year in advance, the water hauled and melted with real effort, the illness held at bay through careful prevention and inherited remedy, the forest quietly providing food and fuel in equal measure, the children learning and playing within the same rhythm their parents and grandparents had followed before them, that gives tonight's story its real depth and its real honesty. This wasn't simply a cosy postcard of firelight and wool blankets, pleasant as that image genuinely is. It was an entire integrated system of survival, built with real skill across real generations, in which comfort and safety, warmth and health Work and rest were never really separate things at all, but different faces of the very same careful, patient effort to keep a family alive and well through the long Nordic dark. There's a particular image worth holding on to as we bring tonight's journey to its actual close, and it's one we've circled around from nearly the very beginning without quite naming it directly until now. Picture the whole valley from a slight distance, the way you might see it if you'd climbed a little way up the nearest ridge on a clear, bitterly cold evening and simply turned to look back the way you'd come. Scattered across the dark, snow-covered landscape, small points of warm orange light, chimney smoke rising straight up into still, freezing air, each one marking a single household, doing exactly what we've spent this whole video exploring in such close, careful detail. Tending a fire, layering wool, gathering close, settling, eventually, into a hard-won, well-earned sleep. None of those households could see each other most nights. The distances were too great, the dark too complete, the isolation in any practical sense entirely real. And yet, there's something quietly moving in imagining all of them together anyway, dozens or hundreds of nearly identical small dramas of warmth and care, unfolding independently across the same frozen valley, the same rhythm repeating itself in cabin after cabin, family after family, night after night, all winter long, nobody watching over any of it, nobody needing to. Because by this point in the story, by however many generations it had taken to refine every single detail we've walked through tonight, from the notched corner joints of the log, walls to the exact ratio of ash needed to bank a fire safely through 8 hours of untended dark, this way of living had become something close to instinct, quiet, practiced, utterly reliable competence, exercised without fuss or fanfare, night after night, by people who simply understood, deeply and completely, exactly what their harsh corner of the world demanded of them, and had long since learned how to meet that demand with something that looks an awful lot like grace. It's easy, looking back at this from the comfort of wherever you're actually lying right now, warm bed, reliable heating, a lamp you can extinguish with nothing more than a small switch, to romanticize all of this a little too readily, to see only the cozy firelight and the shared wool blankets, and miss the genuine hardship sitting right alongside them. We've tried, honestly, across tonight's journey, not to let that happen entirely. The cold feet on a cold morning floor, the real danger of a birth arriving badly timed against an unreachable storm, the sheer, relentless, repetitive labour required just to keep a household clothed and fed and warm, stretching across an entire year to prepare for a single hard season. None of that was easy, and none of it would have felt, to the people actually living it, like the gentle, atmospheric story we've been telling here tonight. But there's real truth in the atmosphere too, and it doesn't cancel out the hardship. It simply sits alongside it, the way genuine things often do. Because within all of that difficulty, these families built something worth admiring on its own terms, not despite the hardship, but in direct, practical response to it. A rhythm. A set of rituals so refined by repetition that they'd become almost beautiful in their own right, however unglamorous their origins. The particular hush of an evening slowing down around a fire. The specific comfort of a shared bed on the coldest night of the year. The old stories told exactly the same way, in exactly this kind of dim, firelit room, for longer than anyone in that room could have properly traced back. There's a reason these images still resonate now, centuries later, translated loosely into candles and thick sweaters and the modern, marketed comfort of higi and kosselig. Something real sits underneath all of that borrowed aesthetic, and it's this: warmth, deliberately built and carefully tended, shared freely among the people closest to you, against a world that offers you no warmth at all on its own. That idea doesn't really belong to any one century, and it doesn't really need a Nordic winter cabin to be true. It just happens to have been demonstrated here across generation after patient generation, about as clearly and as completely as it's ever been demonstrated anywhere. So here, at the actual end of tonight's story, with the fire in that imagined cabin finally settled down to its last quiet coals, and the whole cold, dark, wind-worn valley outside finally properly still, I think that's a good place to leave you. Whatever room you're actually lying in right now, however far removed it is from log walls and banked embers and hand-spun wool, I hope some small piece of that same old, well-earned quiet has made its way into it tonight. Thank you, genuinely, for spending this evening in the cabin with us here at Bedtime Survivalist. Thanks again to the viewer whose comment sent us looking into this particular winter in the first place, and to all of you who've stuck with us this far into the dark. If tonight's journey helped carry you off, a like goes a long way toward helping this channel keep finding stories like this one, and if you haven't already, subscribing means you won't miss wherever the next quiet corner of history happens to take us. The full audio's on Spotify too, along with the extended 8-hour version for the nights you'd rather not properly resurface until morning. Sleep well, stay warm, and I'll see you in the next one.